Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia daf Kuf Gimel. Just the schedule for the next few days. Tomorrow is Erev Chag. I'll be teaching as usual, and after that, just like on Fridays, the Shiur for Shavuot for the first day will go up. Shiur for the second day will go up only after because in Israel it's not Shavuot. I'll be teaching as usual the rest of the week. Not much to the rest of the week, but I'll be teaching as usual. Okay. We're going to get started with our question at the bottom of Kuf Bet and Bet that we ended with. We're going to have a bunch of issues here where there's an argument between two people. I paid, I didn't pay. Here we're going to have a few cases and comparisons. I want to just give some background before we even get into the case, which is in cases where we require an oath. If you remember this is something we learned many times. The typical oath that we require, like example, modeh b'miktzat, okay, someone claims you owe a lot of money, and then the other person says, listen, I paid half. So we make the person who claims they already paid the other half to take an oath that they pay the other half, and then they're exempt from payment. What I wanted to say here is it's called nishma ve'eno meshalem. Usually the oaths you take generally are you take an oath so as to avoid payment. The oath is usually done in a way that our usual classic, leave the money where it is, status quo. That's usually what happens. But sometimes we flip it to the other side and we say the person who wants to collect the money can take an oath, and usually it's for a unique reason. Like, for example, let's say the person who's supposed to take the oath to be exempt from payment is a person who's not believed when it comes to oaths because we've had some issue with them in the past. They're not a trustworthy person. If they're not a trustworthy person, well, then we're not going to let them do that. And then we're going to flip the oath onto the other side. So today we're going to see another situation why there would be a reason, and it really all depends. I always find this is interesting about what our expectations about human behavior, what we assume, and therefore based on our assumptions of what might be the case, we might actually require, flip the shvuah to the other side. So with all that introduction, let's get started. We had a question they asked Rabbi Yanai, which is going to be interesting because in the end, Rabbi Yochanan is going to explain the answer. But they asked Rabbi Yanai, if we have this issue where you're renting a house and you get into an argument with the landlord and the landlord says, you didn't pay me yet. And you say, what are you talking about? I already paid you. And we already narrowed the case, the end of yesterday's daf, which was to a case where we're talking about the day the rent is due. Because if it's beyond the date, then you believe that you already paid. If it's before the date, we assume you don't pay before you're supposed to pay. So you would have to pay. But if it's on the day of, and we don't know, did you already pay or not? Do we assume like you pay the beginning of the day, and therefore if it's a few hours into the day, we can assume you already paid or not? So Amar le Rabbi Yochanan, last few words on Kuf Bet Amud Bet, Tani Tua, let's learn it from this Tanaitic source. And what they're going to do is they're going to bring a Tanaitic source and say this case and this Tanaitic source is unique for a particular reason, which means that the reverse will be true by us. Okay, that's their way of proof. It's an interesting way of proving something, but it makes sense. Shakhir bismano. Now, a shakhir here is not a socher. A shakhir is a worker. We can call him a poel. It might be easier to distinguish. A worker who has the same problem, bismano. On the day you're supposed to get paid, you go to your employer and say, hey, I didn't get paid yet. And your employer says, what do you mean I paid you? So what happens? And then we're going to learn that case has something unique about it. And because of that, we're going to learn to our case the opposite. So here we have, now it's confusing because the shakhir is not like the socher, because the worker is the one who's trying to get paid. And in our case, it's the landlord who's trying to get paid. So it's the flip, right? You would think the landlord and employer are in the same position. No, it's the opposite. Because again, it's all about who's trying to get money from who. So in this case, the worker's trying to get paid. In our case, the landlord's trying to get paid. In the worker case, nishba v'notel. If it's bismano, if it's the day they're supposed to get paid and the worker claims you didn't pay me, the worker takes an oath. This is a unique oath, as I said before, and can collect their money. Basically, they take an oath and say, you didn't pay me, and they get to collect, which is a very rare kind of oath. Shakhir hu derame Rabbanan shvua alei. Now, the reason why they're the ones who get to take the oath here and get paid is mishum de balabayit talmud b'poalav. Because a person who has, let's say you work for a company that has 20 people. So if this person paid some people and not other people, they can't be expected to distinguish between worker number 1 and worker number 20. They don't always remember who they paid, who they didn't pay. It's not like nowadays where everything's pretty clear. You can just check your records. In those days, apparently they would pay workers without getting any sort of receipt or anything. And the assumption is, and here we get to human behavior, that if you're the worker, right, it's either you got paid or you didn't get paid. And you're going to remember whether you got paid or not. That's basically why you're working, to get your salary. So, I mean, there could be other reasons someone will work, but we all know that you're working also to get paid your salary. You're going to remember if you got paid or not. But the employer won't necessarily remember, did they pay this worker or that worker or that worker? And therefore, we don't let the employer take the oath, because the employer might be so confident that they paid you, but they might have confused you with somebody else. And therefore, and again, it's either they have a lot of workers and confused, and it doesn't mean taru b'po'alav. It doesn't just mean they're busy. I mean, the worker's busy with their work, but that's not what they mean. They mean because he has a lot of workers, he might confuse, and which one he paid and which one he didn't. And therefore, we don't trust him to take an oath, because he might really believe he's telling the truth, but he might just be confused. And therefore, the oath gets given to the shakhir, who gets to now, the worker who gets to now take the oath and get paid. But what do you learn? It's unique to that situation. Here in our case, it's going to be the regular oath. Who takes the oath? The one who doesn't have to pay, right? To exempt themselves from payment, that would be the renter, right? Here we're assuming it's not like a landlord who has a million tenants, because then you could kind of say the same thing. Maybe they just don't remember who paid them, But here we're assuming that it's, one and one, theoretically, each, would remember. But the idea is that we do the typical oath, which is nishba ve'eno mishalem. You take the oath in order not to pay, so it's on the renter. Amar Rava, another case, and then we're going to compare it to some other case and say, they're different cases. There, we were trying to actually say, from the difference between the cases, we're going to learn from one to the other that the opposite is true. Here, we're going to take one case and then say, if you're going to rule that way, well, would you rule the same in some other case? Like, as if, no way, no how. Something must be wrong with your ruling. And then we're going to say, no, they're different. Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman. Haima de'oger le'beita l'chavre le'eser shnim. B'katav le'shtar. So you rent me a house for 10 years and you write a document that says, I'm renting my house out for 10 years. But we didn't put in the document a date when the 10 years start. Now, why is that? We're going to see at the end, what was the point of the shtar? The point of the shtar was that if I'm living in the land for 10 years, very likely I could come after 10 years and say, hey, listen, I've been living here for 10 years, right? We know that there's what's chazaka of 3 years. If you're living in a place for 3 years, you can claim ownership. Because I'll be living there for 10 years, you don't want me to claim later, hey, the land is mine, and who will remember? And someone might think, right, maybe I bought it. And after 3 years, we can assume you might have lost your document, and we believe you if you live there and nobody complains. So you want to make sure that nobody thinks that it's my land. So you write me a document that says I'm renting it to you for 10 years, and then it's clear that it's a rental. Now, I keep the document, okay? And I'm the renter. I have a document that says I'm renting this land. So also, if you try to kick me out, I'll say I'm renting it. But the problem is that we didn't put a date in about the rental agreement. Now, why you would do that is a little odd. But again, the point of the shtar was just to show that I'm not muchzeket bekarka. The karka is not mine. I'm only living here as a rental. And then, Amar le nikita chamesh shanim. After a few years pass, we don't know how many, you claim 5 years has passed already. And I say something like it's only been 3. And we now start to have an argument with how many more years are left in the contract. Meheman, you're believed in this case, even though I'm the one who has the shtar in hand, but you're believed to say it's been 5 years already. So the reason why you're believed is because you have what's called chezkat marakama. You have more rights to this land than I do because you're the original owner. And since I'm only renting, you have more rights, and therefore you're the one who's believed to say how many years I've been in the land. And to keep it more quickly, you're going to get the land back. Amarle, and hopefully you're not lying, right? That's the whole point of making you take an oath. We don't just believe you, we make you take an oath about it. And most people aren't willing to take false oaths. Amarle Rav Achami Difti the Ravina. So now comes in Rav Achami Difti, says to Ravina, wait a minute. If you're saying the person who's holding the document, which is me, the renter, doesn't have a right to take an oath and talk about the shtar, and we let you do it, well, are you going to say the same thing in a loan case where If you loan me 100 zuz in a shtar, okay, let's actually make me the renter, the one who lent you, because I'm the one who's going to end up with the shtar, and that's what we're really comparing. So I lend you 100 zuzim, and then you say, Paratich Palga, I already paid you half. Now, this is not the classic mode of a mikzat, because I have a shtar in hand. Whenever I have a shtar in hand, that's a very strong proof that I didn't get paid back, and we'll see that in a minute. But first, they're going to say, if you claim you already paid me half, we're going to let you take the oath, just like we let you take the oath. Now, that's again, I was holding the shtar in the rental contract, and I'm holding the shtar in the loan. But just like in the rental contract, you get to take the oath about. We all agree there's a shtar. Nobody disagrees with that. It's just a matter of what are the details of the the rental agreement / loan. Did already 5 years pass or not? You get to take the oath about it. Did you pay part or not? You get to take the oath about it. Right? He's saying, is that what you're going to say? No, nobody thinks that. You don't get to take an oath about it in this case, because again, it's not a modem mitzvah, because there's a shtar here. There's a document which gives me a lot of strength, and we'll see why in a minute. So Amalei, Rabina says, no, you can't compare the cases. That's what Rav Midifti was trying to do, is compare the cases and say something must be wrong here, because nobody would say this. But no, Hachi Hashta, what? You're going to say that here? No, it's very different, the cases, because Hatam Shtar Leguvainaka. When it comes to a loan, the whole purpose of the document is to collect the money. And im ita de pare, if you have paid half, ibaile lemichtava agabe, you should have written on the shtar, right? You should have made sure, because again, anytime I have an IOU, I can use that and it will stand up in court. So if I have an IOU for 100 and you pay back 50, you're going to make sure that that IOU is not going to look the same anymore. Either you're going to write in it, we pay back 50 and sign witnesses on it. Inami, we've seen this many times, tavra, or you're going to write a receipt, right, that you're going to pull out and say, here's my receipt that I pay back half. But remember, what was the whole purpose of the shtar of the 10 years? It was just to prove that I don't own this land, that I didn't buy it. So that is different. So I'm holding the shtar, but the shtar is irrelevant for how long and when you can kick me out. The shtar was just saying, I'm a renter, not a buyer. That's all the purpose of the shtar was. But in the shtar for the collection, it was for the purposes of collecting. And therefore, there's no way you would have paid without somehow changing this shtar. Again, either by writing a receipt or by writing on the shtar how much you pay back. And therefore, that's why I'm believed to say, no, you didn't pay back, because I have a shtar in hand, which is very strong. But the shtar in hand that I'm renting for 10 years doesn't give me any strength to prove what date the shtar was, because we don't have a date, and therefore you have the upper hand. Because again, there's a different principle that kicks in, which is you're the owner. Okay, you're the original owner. Now, from here till the next Mishnah, we're going to talk about different arrangements of borrowing and the language we use and what that includes. So I'm a Rav Nachman, and here there's a few different explanations of how to understand this word betuvo. We're going to go with Rashi. Shoel adam betuvo leolam. You can borrow, if I make an arrangement with you, I'm going to borrow your object as long as it's in good condition, meaning as long as it's usable. Like I'm going to borrow your car whenever I want. We make this arrangement. I can borrow your car as long as it still works. Okay, that's kind of what it's saying. Le'olam, forever, right? I'm always going to be, whenever I want, I can borrow it. I'm Rav Mary, Barad bat Shmuel, Rav Mary, the son of the daughter of Shmuel, said, V'hu dekani mine. Okay, this works that I can, what happens is, I borrow something, usually then I return it to you. Once I return it, the borrow agreement is over. But if I said I'm going to borrow it forever, as long as the whole life of this car, then I can give it back to you and take it back whenever I want. Say, oh, today I need a car to borrow, I take it back. I give it back, then I said it again. Okay, I can do this continuously until the car breaks down, but only if, according to Rav Mary, we did a kinyan, like a kinyan sudar, okay, which means we did some action, right? Like we usually pick up a handkerchief to show that we're serious about this arrangement. Otherwise, you could say, oh yeah, I was just saying I'll give you my car anytime I want. I didn't really mean it. But if we did a kinyan, you can't say you didn't really mean it. And I have rights to borrow it whenever I want. Otherwise, if we didn't do a kinyan, Rav Mary says, as soon as I give it back to you, that's the end of my borrowing agreement. Amar Rav Mary, Bereder Rav Ashi, Umahado lekate. But let's say the car breaks down. And now, well, there's parts in the car, right? The tires, let's say we could sell. We can do all sorts of things with them, or I could borrow them. But no, my borrowing agreement is over once the car doesn't work. I don't have a right to borrow the parts of the car. Okay, that's not part of the agreement. Because again, I said betuvo as it's working. Once it stops working and its parts, obviously I have to return to all those parts and I can't borrow them anymore. Amarava, another language. Lend me your hoe to what's the word? To lemirpak. Someone can help me with their translation, but either to plow the field or something like that, to soften the ground, here to dig up a garden. Okay. Okay. Hi pardesa, but I said this garden or this orchard. So I want to borrow it, but now I tell you from the beginning, I'm borrowing for a specific purpose. Okay, I'm borrowing your hoe to dig up my garden. I can only borrow the hoe to dig up my garden. That's it, this garden, whatever garden it is, my garden, someone else's garden, doesn't matter, but whatever garden I specified, that's it. If I say pardesa, I didn't say this pardes, but I said I'm borrowing it to dig up a garden instead of this garden, then Rafik Bey call pardesa debai. Then I can do any garden I want, as long as it's a garden, but not something that doesn't qualify as a pardes. Pardise, my pardesim, my gardens, then obviously Rafik Bazel call pardesa diile. I can use it on any garden I have, but only mine and not anyone else's. Umahadro lekate. And then also, if it breaks, I have to give you back the parts because that wasn't what I borrowed it for. Rav Papa, right? This is just very intuitive. If I say, please lend me this, okay, this well. I want to get water from this well. I want to borrow this well. Unafla, and the well breaks, right? The walls of the well crumble. Lo banela. I can't rebuild this well because I asked for this well and I'm not allowed to rebuild it. Garguta benafla, if I say a well and it collapses, banela, then I can rebuild because I wanted a well. So now I can take, where your well was, I can rebuild it because it's any well I wanted. So now I can just rebuild a well and keep borrowing. Again, we're assuming the well is in your property. Be garguta, if I say I want a space for a well, like and I want to borrow that, then I get to dig in your field. I can dig in a number of different places until I find water, like a place where I can actually get water into a well, till I find. And again, but all this is I have to have done a kinyan. If I didn't do this kinyan sudar, this handkerchief transaction, then I don't get to go that far of rebuilding and redigging, all that. New mission. And this is very similar to the cases that we just ended with in the Gemara. I rent a house and then the house falls down. You have to provide me with a new house, right? This isn't what I would have thought, but right, this is the arrangement. The house falls down, you have to give me a new house. Well, if it was a small house, you can't now rebuild a bigger house because that's more work for me to handle a bigger house to maintain. If it was a big house that we had originally that I rented, you can't build me a small house because I have a lot of kids. I need the space. You can't do that to me. If it had 2 rooms or 1 room, then you can't give me a house with 2 rooms. If it had 2 rooms, you can't give me a house with 1 room. It has to be exactly the same. You can't add more windows or take away windows. If it had 10 windows, it has to have 10 windows. Right? I could say, what do you mean? The house was nice and airy. Now it's, cold and dark, and that's not what the original arrangement was. But unless I agree. If I agree, then it's okay. So now the Gemara says, what are you talking about? If I said I'm renting this house, if the house falls, just like the well, right? The well collapsed. Well, that's it. I rented this house. This house is no longer. And that's really what you would have thought, right? You don't have to build me a new one. If you said house, well then, if you didn't specify what kind of house, so you got this house, and this house falls apart. Okay, so build a new house. I'll give you a house. What's the difference if the house is small or bigger? It wasn't in the arrangement how big the house was going to be. So Amar Rish Lakish, the Amar Le Bayit Shani Maskir Lacham Midat or Kol Kach V'Kach. So Rish Lakish says we must be talking about a case where the rental contract included in it the size of the house. And therefore, when the house collapses, you have to provide me with a house exactly the same size because I put it in the contract, or whoever did, exactly what the size were. You have to provide me with the exact same thing. But the Gemara says Rish Lakish is saying this, but okay, it's obvious if all the details were in the contract, then obviously you'd have to provide a house exactly that size. That's not such a chiddush. Can't be Rish Lakish is saying that. Now remember, in Babylonia, they're learning what Rish Lakish said in Israel. So here comes Ravin now. Ravin Amar Rish Lakish. When Ravin came from Israel, he was one of the people who brought the Torah of Israel to Babylonia. He said, no, this is what Rish Lakish said, meaning you guys got it wrong. That's not really what Rish Lakish said. This is what Rish Lakish said. The Amarle, it wasn't that the contract said exactly the dimensions of the house, but the Amarle Bayit Kazan Maskir said a house like this I am renting you, okay? A house like the house on this street, this number. Now, so Gemara says, okay, that didn't really help us. If you said it's just like this house, then it should be just like this house in size. What's the chiddush? What are you telling us here? To which they answer, again, what's the Mishnah telling us is really their question. Lo tzricha, and here's a kind of interesting way of looking at it. Makes a lot of sense. Dekaya gudedina. Let's say the house was on the banks of the river. So ma'u detema mai kazeh. When you say a house like this could mean like this in size. Like this could mean like this in location. And right, let's say you rent a beach house and then the house collapses and they give you a house not anywhere near the beach. You say, hey, that's not what I wanted. I wanted a beach house. So what they're saying is no. When you say I want to buy it like this, you mean like this in size and you don't mean like this in location. So ma'u detema mai kazeh dekaya gudinara. You might have thought a house like this means a house with a view on the river. No, we're talking about kamashmalan. It's the size of this house. And with that, Hadran al Hashoel, and we finished chapter 8. Congratulations. Okay, we're really getting toward the end. I should already tell you now, since we're getting near the end, that the siyum, I still have a little bit to go. The siyum will be published hopefully later this week. The siyum will be on the 26th of the month, Wednesday evening. And Alana Steinhain will be teaching siyum, so connected with her new book, so you can hear about her new book of Circumventing the Law, very relevant topic for our Masechet. Okay, now I want to just review before we move on to the next chapter, which is what we did today. So we started with this question of renter, landlord, tenant having a disagreement. Was the rent paid? We compared it to a worker, how it's different. Then we said, what about the 10-year contract? Who's believed there? How many years have passed already? And there we say the landlord's actually believed. Then we moved to different types of rental agreements and language and what each language includes. If you rent or actually more borrowing things. And then we got to renting a house and what different wording means that you're able to get based on that wording. In many of the cases we saw, you actually have to do a kinyan to show seriousness of purpose. And now we're going to move on to the next chapter. The first part of this 9th chapter, we have 2 more chapters in Bava Metzia. The first part of this 9th chapter is really related to chachirut and arisim. These are different types of sharecroppers, and we'll go through the laws again. Sharecropper is someone who works on someone's land. Okay, so there's the landowner. The landowner gives over the land to the aris, the sharecropper, and the sharecropper works, takes all the produce from the land, and gives a percentage of it to the landlord. Okay, to the landowner, we'll call him in this case. Gives a percentage to the landowner. We're going to see later that it's usually, interestingly, the sharecropper gets 2/3 of the produce because the sharecropper is really doing all the work, and the owner gets 1/3. That's an unusual arrangement. Then we have a chokhir. Chokhir is a different kind of sharecropper where they work in the land. They get all the produce, but they commit in the beginning of the season, I will give the landlord X amount of produce. But it doesn't depend, was the aris depends on how much produce there was in the field that year. It's a percentage of whatever there is. The chokhir gives X amount no matter what happens. So it could work to their advantage. It could work to their disadvantage because there could be a bad year. And then they still have to give what they committed in the beginning of the year. It could be a great year and they'll get a ton and only have to pay what they agreed to pay in the beginning of the year. So these are two different types of arrangements that people made in those days. So now we're going to talk about really both of them. So you work at somebody's field. Now there's certain things that are based on what we're going to do. This Mishnah is all about minhag hamakom, what is normally done. So, and we're going to see why this is significant later, why you would do one or the other. Makom shenagu liktzor yiktzor la'akor ya'akor. There's two ways you can harvest crops. You can cut it, okay, like using a sickle and cutting it, but not from the roots. You could pull it out from the roots, okay? Seems like, right, you would think normally you do the ktsira with a sickle, but sometimes you will pull it out with the roots. So whether or not one can force the other, okay, whereas the owner can say, you must do it in this way, or you must do it in that way, really, or the reverse, the sharecropper would say, I'm only doing it this way. Well, they can only force the hand of the other if that's the general custom. So if the custom is to cut with a sickle, let's say, so each side, we're going to see later, each side can insist that it's done that way. But if the minhag is to uproot with the roots, uproot entirely, then they can insist again. So again, the landowner could say, I insist that you pull it out with the roots. Or the sharecropper can say, I'm doing it with the roots, even if the other person doesn't want, right? The landowner doesn't want it that way. If the typical, again, the custom in the land is that after the harvesting is done, you do plowing. Usually you plow in the beginning of the season, but you also could plow at the end of the season to get rid of all the weeds, to weed out and have the land ready for the next season. Well, if that's the custom, then that's what, the landowner can insist that the aris do that as part of their work. Hakol kiminhag hamakom. Everything is, right, which later the Gemara is going to say, right, if we already said, makom shenagu, why do you need this extra line? It's obvious it all goes by the custom of the land. This must be coming to include something additional. Now we're going to talk about what parts get divided and what parts are kept with the landowner. Kashem shechokim b'tvuah, just like they split the produce, kach chokim b'teven u'bakash. Okay, the teven are the long straw that all the wheat is like the stalk is basically straw. So there's the bigger pieces that, once you separate all that, so then you end up with these bigger pieces from the stalk, and the kash are the little pieces that are left in the ground or near the ground, kind of small pieces. So they also split that because people use that for animals to eat. They use it for other things. So they use it for fertilizer, we're going to see. So that also gets split up. You might have thought that's just, the junk that gets left with the landowner, but no, it gets split. Now here, right, that was in the grains. Now we're going to say when it comes to wine. So just like they split the wine, the proceeds, right? Moving out on Amubet, bizmorot ubekanim. The bizmorot are the stems of the vines. And the kanim, we'll see later in the Gemara is going to say, I'm sorry, I'm giving away the punchline, but it's not the most fascinating. The kanim are the reeds that they would, so that the vines don't drape on the floor, they tie them up. We do this nowadays, right? They're tied up on these sticks. Those are the reeds that they would use to tie up the vines. So also those get split. And by the way, now they talk about costs. Who has to pay for the reeds with which we tie up those vines? It's split between the sharecropper and the owner, which seems okay. Well, obviously, if they're splitting the price and they're splitting they get it back at the end. The Gemara is going to say that line comes to explain the previous line. The reason why they split these reeds is because they actually split the cost from the beginning, and that's why at the end, when the season's over, they share them as well. The Gemara starts off with quoting a Braita, which basically sounds like our Mishnah by adding one extra line, which is what we're going to then focus on. Tana. The Braita says, now we're going to finally understand why one would prefer cutting or one would prefer uprooting. And the Mishnah, the Braita tells us, which the Mishnah didn't say, although I kind of said it already when we were learning the Mishnah, which is each side can insist the other side do like the custom of the land. Okay? Now, let's see why each side would want one or the other. So we're going to explain everything from two different perspectives and And it's the opposite because some people might prefer liktsor, some people might prefer la'akor. Liktsor no rasha la'akor. So if the custom is to cut, then you can't uproot. Now let's start with, if I'm the sharecropper, I can't uproot because the landowner can insist, hi Amr, the landowner can say, Bi'ina dititaben li'arai. I want you can't uproot because I want the little pieces that stay in when you don't uproot, like those dried, roots and stuff and the little stubble at the bottom. I want it to stay there because that will fertilize my land for next season. The high Amr, now let's say it's the opposite. So again, the custom is to cut and you want me to uproot. I could say, no, I'm not uprooting. I'm doing the custom of the land. Why? High Amr lo metzia. I can't. It's too hard to physically uproot each thing with all the root. It's harder to do that than it is to just cut with a sickle. So I could say that's too hard for me, above my pay grade. La'akori no rashai l'kitzol. Now let's do the reverse. If the custom is to uproot with the roots, so again, we're going to have to see in both directions. Why would one want to insist that the other do it? So you can't cut, okay? You have to uproot. So hi, Amar, if let's say I'm the sharecropper and I say, I don't want to do the custom of the land. I just want to cut. It's much easier. Hi, Amar, you say I want to clean. I don't want anything in it. And that's the custom of the land. I don't want any messy roots and all that in the land, right? That's the opposite of you wanted a fertilizer. In this case, no, I want a nice clean field. So you can insist I do that. Hi, Amar, tivna. And I say, I want you, okay, in this case, it's the reverse. The minhag is to uproot. You say, I just want you to cut. I don't want you to uproot. And I say, no, I want the teven for my animals to eat. So I can insist that we uproot it so that all the roots will be there. So my animals, they'll be up and uprooted so that my animals can eat. So I can insist on that because again, that's the custom of the land. Now, why did you have to say at the end of that braita that each side can insist the other? Isn't that kind of included? So that's what we just explained. If the makom is this, then either side can insist. So they say, well, it's a matam kamar, and we're going to see this later in the Mishnah as well, that one line comes to explain the reason behind the other. So the last line is explaining the reason. Matam liktsori no rashala kor lakori no rashala liktso mishum deshneim akvin zalzeh. The reason why you have to follow the custom is because each one can insist that the other one, that it's not good, it's not what they want. And since that's the custom, they're allowed to insist. Lachrosh achalav yachosh, if the custom is to plow after you're finished, to get rid of all the weeds, then you can insist they plow, right? The landowner can insist that the sharecropper plow. It says pshita, okay, this is quite obvious. If that's the custom, obviously you can insist. So what's this coming to teach us? It's a case where they didn't generally weed things. It's a place where people don't generally do weeding before the harvesting. But this person, okay, me, the sharecropper, I weeded before I did the harvesting. And then what happened? You have to say, and Rashi says this, that then a few weeds grew in between the time I did the weeding and the time I harvested. There's a few weeds there. I could say, listen, it wasn't the custom to weed here, but I did the weeding. That was, I did the weeding so that I wouldn't have to plow after. And you think I could get away with that? Even though, okay, a few grew, but it's basically mostly weeded. I did a lot of the work already, and I did it to avoid having to plow. Kamashma, the Mishnah comes to teach you, no. If the minhag is to plow after, and I happen to just do what not the minhag wasn't, and I weeded before without even telling you, well, I had to have told you. In other words, if I made an arrangement with you before and I said, listen, I'm going to weed now instead of plowing later, and you agreed, then that would be fine. But if I did it on my own without telling you, and I just did it, and then try to claim later, well, I'm not going to plow because I did the weeding before, you could say, hey, I didn't want you to do the weeding before. I want to do the plowing at the end so that there'd be nothing left and my field would be totally clean. Now that some new things grew, well, you have to plow. That's what it was coming to teach us. Not just a regular case, which obviously I would have to plow after. But if I weeded without telling you, then I have to weed it. Then I have to do the plowing at the end. And as I told you before, we're going to go back to this line of kolkim and hagim medina. What's that coming to include? There's no reason to say that, if not to say something new, because it was already implied from the Mishnah. Hakola atuye mai, what's this coming to include? Atuye hadatanu Rabbanan. It's coming to talk about the following case. It appears in a bright. So the Mishnah is kind of referencing this case. Makom shnagu laskir ilanot al gabe karka maskirin. Makom she'ein nohagu laskir ein maskirin. Trees are different than crops. Usually we talk about a sharecropper, okay, cropper, right? Crops, we think of crops as grains, rice, things like that. But if there's trees don't need a lot of tending to. You don't need to plant them every year. You don't need to deal with them much. I mean, you need to do some work on them, but they're not as much work as the crops. And usually the sharecropper was working the crops. The trees grow year after year without planting, without all that. So they're different. The question is, does the sharecropper get a share if I take a field and in the field there's also trees? Do I get a share in those trees or not? So again, it all depends on minhag hamakom. If generally that was included last year, here we mean not to rent, but it's included as part of the sharecropper agreement, because the sharecropper in essence is like a renter, then they get a percentage of it. But if it's a place where generally the trees are not included, then you don't get a percentage of the fruits. Makom shnagu laskir maskirim pshita. Again, they say this is quite obvious. Okay, we're going to start with the first line, and then we're going to do the same with the second line. If generally you get the fruits, then obviously you get the fruits. Why are you telling me this? Isn't it pretty clear? Well, lotzricha, and this is going to sound a lot like the case we had in the 6th chapter of labor relations. Okay, you can already start thinking as I read it. De kule alma yahave betilta. The case is, okay, where they had to tell you this. If normally sharecroppers give a third of the produce to the owner, the landowner, and I gave you less than the usual, okay, I gave you only a quarter. You could say to me, listen, I was willing to take less. Remember that we had this with the worker, and if you're willing to take less salary, right, take a lower rate than everyone else, maybe it's, or take a higher rate, maybe it's because you thought, right, the lower rate because you thought that, oh, they'd throw in all sorts, right, they were going to pay, or you agreed to this because you thought, oh, maybe they were giving you more, right? There were all sorts of things where you could claim, oh, I assumed you were giving me less because you weren't taking the fruits from the trees. So even though we live in a place where everyone takes the fruits from the trees, I assumed, says the landowner, that if you're giving me only a quarter, it means that I'm taking all the fruits, though. And I'm obviously not going to take less than everyone else gets, if not that I'm getting something in return. So, so the Mishnah is telling you, no, if the custom is that the sharecropper gets fruits from the tree, then in this case, also the sharecropper is going to get fruits from the tree, unless, right, don't ever assume, this is a good lesson when you go into any arrangement with anyone, don't assume that they're just throwing something in unless you have them specify it. Otherwise, you're going to have no rights to demand it. Now they're going to do the reverse case. If it's a place where you don't generally get the fruits, the sharecropper, then you're not going to get the fruits. Again, pshita, to which they say, let's do the reverse case. Everybody usually in this place gives the owner only a quarter. But But this sharecropper said, oh, you know what? I'll give you a third. I'll give you more. And I'll take less for myself. I'll only get 2/3. No. You want to say, oh, well, I gave you more because I assumed you were going to give me the fruits, right? Not like the typical custom here, but I thought you would add in the fruits. And that's why I was willing to give you more of the crop because I was going to get fruits. But again, it comes to teach you, the Mishnah, that you should have specified. And if you don't specify, you don't get it. So the Mishnah says, now remember the Mishnah is written in Israel and in the time of the Tanaim. So the Mishnah says we split the straw, right? The 2 different types of straw. Amar Rav Yosef, but comes Rav Yosef, who's living in Babylonia a few generations later. In Bavel, they don't give the teben, that straw, to the aris, the sharecropper. What's his point here? What's he telling us? If you see someone who does give it a percentage of that to the sharecropper, he's just being overly nice, overly generous as a landowner, and we don't say, oh, other people have to do the same. No. Amar Rav Yosef. Buchra v'tafta v'arakavta. Okay, if you have a Quran, I have a really good picture of this, but if not, I'll try to explain it to you as best as I can. What people would do is to make, okay, now we're going to talk about what expenses are on the sharecropper and what expenses are on the landowner. So what we're going to basically say, and we'll see this in a minute, is the basics are on the owner, like for, let's say, protecting the field. But anything in addition is on the sharecropper. Like anything that makes the sharecropper's life easier is on the sharecropper. Okay, if it's the basics though, so we're going to talk about. They would dig around their field and then make, like almost when you make a sandcastle, right? You dig and then you take the dirt there and you use it as your wall to protect your whatever you're digging, right? So now in this case we have a field and you want to put up a wall around the field. So you dig and then you take the dirt and you put it. Now first you do one layer, then you do a second layer, then you do a third layer, right? You do one layer, it dries. Second layer, it dries. Third layer, it dries of all this dirt or soil. So buchra, tafta, and arkavta are the three stages. First stage of the soil, the second stage, the third of building this, and kani dechizra. You want to make a fence of thorns. So you're going to like weave thorns into these reeds. So you put up first the reeds, okay? And then you interweave the thorns to make the fence. So the first stages of the first three of the soil that you're using to make the wall and the reeds that you're going to put in and stand them up there, that's all on the balabayit. But the chizra gufe, the thorns themselves, like the material you're going to use to actually weave in the fence, that's on the aris, the sharecropper. Klala de milta, the rule is, kol ikar blama, the basics for protecting the field are on the balabayit, which is making this wall basically. Nitiruta yiterata de arisa. But actually filling it in is already the aris is the sharecropper's responsibility because it's already somewhat protected. And then their job is to make sure nothing else comes in. So if they want to, build this, interweave this material to make the fence better, to block it better, well, that's their responsibility. I'm Rav Yosef. Here's another case. Mara uzvila v'davla bizarnuka. Okay, the hoe, the shovel, a pail that you're going to use to basically water the field, and the zarnuka, which is this is also something they would use to fill up water in order to bring it to water the field. This is all for irrigation. That is all debalabayit. Okay, the owner needs to provide the basic needs for watering the field. Okay, but arisa avibeya ore. But if you want to dig, okay, you want to dig a channel from the river to the field to basically make it easier for you to get your water into the field without you having to go take your pail or your flask, fill it up with water and bring it. Well, that already is your responsibility as the sharecropper. So now we're back to the Mishnah, and now we're going to explain these two things that I already explained to you at the time. What are we doing with these reeds? They're reeds that they smooth out, right? They take off all the harsh stuff on it, whatever, like the what do you call it? The klipa, things that like they just kind of clean it off, straighten it out. That they use as stakes in order to attach the vines. Why do you need that line? And I already told you this before. Matam kamar, again, it's a matam. Matam shnehem chalukim b'kanim. Why at the end do they split those reeds? Mishum tishnehem mesapkim etakanim, because they both provided from the beginning. That's part of the shared expense, and therefore they get to split it at the end. New Mishnah. If you take a field as a sharecropper, okay, I'm the sharecropper in our story, so I take a field from you, and this field was a beit hashlachim. The way they explain beit hashlachim in this case, even though sometimes it's not exactly that, it's a field that needs irrigation, meaning it's not enough to live on rainwater, but it has a river. Usually it doesn't, but in this case, it has a river or a stream that goes through, okay, and basically waters it with that, okay, or it makes it very easy to water, or it has a lot of trees, which also makes it very easy to get the crops, right, get fruits without having to work too hard. But Yavash Hamayam v'niktzatz ha'ilan. So I thought I was getting a good deal. But then the Mayan dries up, the stream, or the tree gets cut down, right? It falls down in a storm. And now I'm not going to get all that produce I thought I was getting. Now, in this case, we're talking about a sharecropper aris type, where I get a percentage of the proceeds, and and I pay you a percentage. So what happens here? I'm sorry, the opposite. In that case, it would be fine because there'd be less and you would get less and I would get less. But if I'm a chochel, and that's what we're going to say, if I promised you from the beginning to pay you X amount, thinking that I was getting an easy job and therefore I was willing to pay you like a decent amount because I don't have to work so hard and I'm going to get a lot of produce, and now I don't because now I have to work much harder to bring the water from go find water somewhere else, and now my trees are dead. So eino menakelo min chachoro. But since I never specified that in the deal, I can't deduct that at all. But im amar lo chachor li sadeh beit hashlachim zo o steh beit ilan zeh. But if I included it in the agreement, and you said, right, I want you to be a sharecropper on this field, right, which is a beit hashlachim or which has trees, and it was explicitly stated. And then yavash hamayam v'niktzatz ilan menakelo min chachoro. Right, this sounds a little like insurance, right? Was it included? Did you have earthquake insurance? Did you, right? So did you specify it? And then if that happens, okay, we're going to talk about this. We'll get to the Gemara on it. I'll start the Gemara tomorrow because there's not much on this stuff. So we'll start tomorrow and see what the Gemara is going to say. Well, what exactly is the situation? And it's going to connect a little with earthquakes and things that are, well, what's my fault? But we'll get there. So this part of the doc was really to just summarize very simply. We're talking about arrangements between, just like we had before, socher and maskir and this and that, arrangement and an employer and employee. Now we're on arrangements between sharecroppers and their landowners, and who's responsible for what, who pays for what, who gets, percentage of which produce, right? Trees, yes or no, all these things, and what the expectations are of the work that the sharecropper is going to do. All of this is basically dependent on minhag hamakom. That was the main idea. And then, going through details of what these are. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.